Welcome to Dixon Entrance 2018. I'm Steve Best, and this is the coast of BC, my favorite place in the world. Since 1995, I've been making my way around the outer coast of BC. Along the central coast and the west coast of Vancouver Island, from Bella Bella to Tofino and Barkley Sound, and down the west coast of Haida Gwaii. In 2018, I had quite a busy summer with no time for a 3-week trip, much less the 5 or 6 weeks it would take me to get from Prince Rupert to Bella Bella. I decided on a 1-week solo trip to take place in mid-August. And looking at the charts, I decided it would be to this group of islands north of Prince Rupert in Dixon Entrance, the stretch of open ocean between Haida Gwaii and the Alaskan Panhandle. It looked like a nice compact area on the chart, and it wasn't until a month before the trip, when I belatedly started to plan it, that I realized that I had bitten off more than I had thought. Distances were greater than I imagined, and it would be an out and return, unlike the one-way trips I had been doing. All that meant that I was trying to cram what should have been at least a 2-week trip into what turned out to be 9 days. This area has a lot of big open crossings, not my favorite thing, and 20-foot tides, so tidal currents would be a significant factor. My route, shown here in red, would take me from Port Edward, just south of Prince Rupert, across to Lucy Islands, and up the protected inside of the Dundas Group to the Gnarled Islands, just 4 nautical miles across an open stretch of water from the American border, shown here in green. I would then head out to Zayas Island, the farthest out of the islands, and down the outside of the Dundas Group to the Lucy Islands again, and back to Port Edward, for a total of 89.8 nautical miles, or 166 kilometers. This is my GPS track in Garmin Base Camp. The shot shows over 50 potential campsites from the BC Marine Trails inventory, but because they either haven't been ground-proofed by Marine Trails members, or their status hasn't been determined with local First Nations, only 2 of them, Lucy Islands and Island 42, are visible to the public on the BC Marine Trails map. On Thursday, August 9th, my girlfriend Claire and I headed off on a 2-day road trip from Squamish through the smoky interior of BC to the Ocean View Hotel in Prince Rupert, the only corner of BC that wasn't covered in smoke from the wildfires, and dinner in their pub overlooking the Prince Rupert Harbor. This should have been the night before the start of my kayak trip, but earlier that afternoon I discovered that I had left my dry suit in Squamish. So what do you do when you make that discovery a day and a half into a 2-day road trip, and it's after 3 on a Friday, and UPS and FedEx can't deliver it to Prince Rupert until Tuesday? You have your daughter in Squamish pick up the dry suit, and you have your son-in-law, who's working the next day in North Vancouver, 3 blocks from Claire's house, take it to Claire's. And the next morning, Claire and I took the ferry to Prince Rupert's Digby Island Airport, where I joined Claire on the Saturday morning flight back to Vancouver, where Claire's son Thomas drove my dry suit to the airport. This is the evening flight back to Prince Rupert, and that's Kitson Island, a BC Marine Park, just off the channel to Port Edward, and very close to Prince Rupert. And there's Port Edward. At the lower left corner of the window is the beach at Tremaine Bay, just south of the runway on Digby Island. We'll see this beach again a couple of times on the trip. On Sunday morning, a day after I was supposed to start the trip, here I am at the boat launch in Port Edward. There's really nowhere other than the 2 concrete launch ramps to load your boat, so I was lucky that a drift log had put one of the ramps out of commission, giving me a spot to load, tucked behind the drift log. Day 1. My first day would take me from my launch at Port Edward out Porpoise Channel to Chatham Sound, across the mouth of Prince Rupert Harbour to Tremaine Bay, where I took a break, then along the Digby Island shore, ending with a 3.5 nautical mile crossing to Lucy Islands in the middle of Chatham Sound, for a total of 15.6 nautical miles. You'll note that the 1 to 40,000 scale charts don't show Prince Rupert itself, and that's because they want you looking at a larger scale chart of the harbor instead. So let's look at it from space instead. Prince Rupert is just north of the mouth of the Skeena River, and the city lies at the foot of a mountain on Cane Island. The harbor is protected by another low island, Digby Island, with the airport along its western edge. Just south of Cane Island is another smaller harbor at Port Edward, and this is where I chose to start the trip. So here we are, ready to go. In his 2006 book, The Wild Coast 2, John Camantis writes of being warned about the black flies on Dundas Island. The young lady on the dock is Caitlin. She's a Port Edward local, and she works for the local First Nations fishery management. Her job is to record the salmon being brought in, and to take the fish heads in her cooler. What a great job. Well, she also warned me about black flies on Dundas Island, and the day before, a deckhand on the airport ferry warned me about black flies on Dundas Island, so I made sure to pack bug dope. But neither John Camantis nor I were bothered by bugs on our trips. So let's go paddling. There's the boat launch near the seaward end of Port Edward's commercial waterfront. Heading out Porpoise Channel and into Chatham Sound. You can see the beginnings of a fog bank in the distance, and this would be a sign of things to come today. There's the mouth of Prince Rupert Harbour ahead, with Coast Island on the near side and Digby Island in the distance. Here we are at Coast Island, and there's an incoming freighter on the left. A few minutes later, and the freighter is passing ahead, so I called Prince Rupert Harbour traffic on my marine radio to tell them I'm crossing the shipping channel behind the freighter. The wind coming up a bit as we crossed the channel. I needed to go ashore for a break, so I pulled into the beach at Tremaine Bay on Digby Island, which has a nice reef protecting the beach. This is the same beach we had seen from the airplane, and it seems the locals call it Skidder Beach. After a break and the turn of the tide, it was time to get back on the water. Fog beginning to thicken as we paddle through rock gardens on the west coast of Digby Island, and I figure I'll be making the crossing to Lucy Islands by compass course and GPS. But as I'm about to start the crossing, the fog lifts enough to see Lucy Islands 3.5 nautical miles away. Coming up to Lucy Islands and the lighthouse at the eastern tip. Paddling into the gap between the islands, with the tombolo between the 2 main islands coming into view. Landing on the tombolo. Lucy Islands is a conservancy collaboratively managed by BC Parks and 2 local First Nations. A beautiful sunset to end the first day of the trip. That's my tent the next morning on the tent platform, my boat close by. And that's the boardwalk that leads across the island to the lighthouse. The reason for the tent platform and the boardwalk is this guy, the rhinoceros auklet. Lucy Islands is one of their 8 significant nesting sites in BC. And they are quite the characters. The sign reads, "They land by hurling themselves towards trees at night, crashing into branches and falling to the ground. Once on land, they scurry at speed, stumbling and tripping over roots and rocks." In fact, on my return to Lucy Islands at the end of my trip, I had one fly into my tent in the middle of the night and scurry away. On day 2, I would cross to the Dundas Group. The 4 main islands in the Dundas Group, Dundas, Barron, Dunera, and Melville, were all named by Captain Vancouver for the same guy, Henry Dundas, Baron Dunera and Viscount of Melville. Day 2 started with a 4.5 nautical mile upwind crossing to Melville Island, then up the sheltered east side of Melville Island to a beach on the east side of Dunera Island. Ready to launch? As I was about to launch, 2 sport fishermen from Prince Rupert pulled up for a shore break. Launching. And leaving Lucy Islands on the 4.5 nautical mile crossing to Melville Island, appearing in the distance as the fog lifts. Arriving at the sheltered east side of Melville Island. Looking up the passage between Melville and Dunera Islands. And now en route up the channel between Dunera and the chain of much smaller Moffat Islands that runs up the east side of Dunera. Arriving at the beach on the east side of Dunera Island. It's not a particularly pretty beach, but it's in the right place and had room in its upland for my tent and boat. Kitchen on a log. The beach at low tide on a rainy morning. Day 3. My route on day 3 would be up the east side of Dunera and Dundas Islands to the Gnarled Islands. I wanted to stay on the Gnarled Islands, both for their location, at the very northern tip of the Dundas Group, and for their name. Ready to launch? The rain brought with it a light southeasterly tailwind, so instead of clinging to shore for shelter from the northwesterlies, I headed for open water to take as much advantage of the tailwind as I could. There's Dundas Island, just visible to the left. Some rocks along the east shore of Dundas Island. Approaching the north end of Dundas Island. Rounding Whitley Point at the north end of Dundas Island, with the Gnarled Islands in view ahead. Coming into land at the Gnarled Islands. This is at spring tide, and at springs there's not much beach left at high tide. But behind the logs is a patch of sand just large enough for my tent. With my kayak slid between the Devil's Club in the somewhat soggy upland. The beach is quite nice with the sun coming out at a lower tide in the morning. Day 4. My route on day 4 would take me across the north end of Dundas Island, and then a 4 nautical mile crossing to Zayas Island, the farthest west of the islands, sitting out on its own in Dixon Entrance. Only one corner of Zayas makes it onto the 1 to 40,000 chart, so I've pasted in a printout from the Marine Trails map. The Marine Trails inventory shows 5 campsites on Zayas, but 3 of them are believed to be First Nations reserves, and one of the others looks unappealing. That leaves the southernmost site, and this is how it looks from space. That is one reason I wanted to get out to Zayas. Ready to launch, and the sun has come out. Launching. And heading out. John Camantis notes that there are residences and cottages along Goose Bay near the northwest corner of Dundas Island, so I wasn't surprised to see several boats out fishing. The boats all seem to be the same type and more utilitarian than the sport fishermen out of Prince Rupert. The north end of Dundas Island. And there's Goose Bay. And here's a look at the north coast of Dixon Entrance. And everything you can see is Alaska, until we get to the Gnarled Islands behind us. Here we're leaving the little islands off the northwest corner of Dundas Island and heading across to Zayas, 4 nautical miles away. Arriving at the north end of Zayas Island, at one of the sites believed to be First Nation Reserve, and these appear to be seasonal or abandoned dwellings. It has a nice beach. That's Dundas Island in the distance as we paddle down the east coast of Zayas Island. And here we are, coming into our target beach, Zayas Island Southeast, Lanique. A view of the beach in the morning. There is an upland tent site behind the beach, but I chose to camp on the beach. A nice board for a kitchen counter. Day 5. Another reason for visiting Zayas Island is it has a lake on it, so there should be a reliable stream, and I needed to replenish my water. So the day started in the wrong direction, with a visit to a nearby beach, before crossing back to Dundas Island and paddling down the rugged west coast of Dundas Island. A view of the beach at low tide as I'm about to launch. and a view of today's crossing. Half a mile back in the wrong direction, and the other, less appealing beach on Zayas to replenish my water. I usually try to camp where I can replenish my water to avoid just this, the hassle of another landing and another launch. But the other beach was appealing enough, and this beach was unappealing enough that I was willing to make an exception. The beach was littered with rocks, so I tied my boat to one and hiked up the beach to the stream. Zayas Island is pretty flat, so the water is brown even after you filter it. Getting back to my boat as the tide is just about to reach it. And then heading off on a 4 nautical mile crossing back to Dundas Island. Coming up on Dundas Island, the beach on the left is First Nations Reserve. The west coast of Dundas Island is wonderful paddling, all rock gardens and waves. That's Dundas Island West on the left, a potential marine trail site with wonderful protection. More rock gardens, and channels. Coming into the beach at Dundas Island Southwest. The forecast for the next day was for south winds. I'd been planning to paddle farther, but this looked like the perfect place to hunker down for a day. It looks like tent sites could easily be cleared in the uplands, and it might be necessary at spring tides. But we're approaching neap tides. So we're gonna camp on the beach. My tent in the morning set up on the beach. A nice kitchen in the weathered roots at the end of a long drift log. With a headwind out on the water, Day 6's objective would be terrestrial rather than aquatic, a hiking circumnavigation of my little island. Here we're on the west side of the island. That's Prince Rupert Island to the southwest. And out Dixon Entrance to the west, nothing but ocean until you get to Japan. At the north end of the island, the shoreline rocks turned into shoreline cliffs, and I had to head into the island's interior and bushwhack through the Devil's Club. Back in camp, a rain shower blew through, so I set up the Camp Dundas dining hall before kicking back with some Irish whiskey. On day 7, weather conditions and geography combined to make this day a highlight of the trip. My route would take me through the islands at the south end of Dundas Island, then a 5.5 nautical mile crossing to a group of islands on the west side of Melville Island, then another 5 nautical mile crossing to Lucy Islands, for a total of 11.4 nautical miles. Ready to launch on the north side of the Tombolo. Paddling out the channel through the reefs to the north. And past the north end of the island I had camped on and walked around the day before. That's Prince Rupert Island ahead, which seems like a weird name. The island was named after a ship that Captain Vancouver encountered, that was, in turn, named after a prince in the South Pacific. Paddling through channels at the south end of Dundas Island, you can see from the kelp that the tide is going my way. And I'm getting a nice boost from the tide. Before heading off on a 5.5 nautical mile crossing. The wind has come up as we start the crossing, so let's go fly a kite. Clipping the kite string off to my deck and getting my paddle back out. Here we are doing a steady 4 knots without paddling a stroke as we pick our way through kelp beds in the middle of the crossing. Getting close to the other side, and it's time to get the kite down. I take a bit more care than usual packing up the kite, as I know I'm going to be using it again today. Then it's back to paddling as we head for our next objective. A drive-by of the beach at Island 42. It's a beautiful beach, and it is supposed to be popular with boaters, but today it is deserted. This site is well enough used to actually make it onto the Marine Trails map, though not as an official site. paddling through the intertidal channels between the islands. Some of them quite shallow. There's the beach at Island 35, another beautiful spot and another potential marine trails site. If I were planning another trip to this area, I'd plan to spend several days around here on the west side of the Dundas Group. I decide to try to sneak through the channel east of Island 35. My timing with the tide turns out to be good, and I'm able to just slip through. There are more beaches on the Melville Island shore, and that one is recommended by John Camantis. Next is that little island ahead on the right. There's another beach and potential marine trail campsite on this little island just off the south end of Melville Island. It's not as pretty as some of the other beaches, but it's strategically located just before the crossings to Lucy Islands or the Tree Knob Group. And then it's off again on another long crossing. And once we're away from land, the wind is strong enough to let the kite do the work. I had been thinking of heading to the Rachel Islands, about twice as far away as Lucy, but I was sure it would be windy again tomorrow, and that would mean a long crosswind crossing from Rachel Islands to Kitson Island, and from Lucy it would be straight downwind under kite to Kitson. This powerboat slowed down as it passed and asked if I was okay. Maybe they thought my kite was a distress signal. Taking down the kite as we approach Lucy Islands. Paddling in between the islands. The tide is high enough that I can land on a bit of beach right in front of the tent platform. Drying the kite so it will be ready for tomorrow's crossing. Set up again on the tent platform. And another beautiful Lucy Islands sunset. The next morning was Sunday, and as I was loading, this boat pulled up. A local guide from Prince Rupert was bringing his client and his client's family out to Lucy for a picnic. The next day, the mum and son would be flying back to Montreal, and the guide would be taking his client to a fishing lodge on Dundas Island. Lucy Islands gets busy on a sunny Sunday. There's the guide and his clients on the right, and another group having a picnic on the left. On day 8, I changed my destination from Kitson Island, and instead crossed to Digby Island and down the coast to Tremaine Bay, where I'd stopped for a break on the way out. Ready to launch, and, in the distance, Stephen Island to the southwest. And to the southeast, our crossing today to Digby Island. I've got a leash on my paddle because I was sure I'd be under kite again today. Heading out, and the hoped-for tailwind is nowhere to be seen. I'm going to have to do my own work today. Before I launched, I had talked to the guide about Kitson Island, and he had warned me that it would be a zoo on a Sunday evening, with anybody from Prince Rupert, with anything that floats there. So I reevaluated and decided to head to Tremaine Bay for the last night of the trip. I knew it was nice, and I would have it to myself. Looking back at Lucy Islands. And across to the eastern shore of Chatham Sound. And Digby Island ahead. A tug from Alaska towing a barge. Paddling through a group of floats, probably commercial crab traps. Arriving at the Digby Island shore. Something I love is when you can paddle the racetrack between the rocky shore and the kelp. That's tiny Martini Island in the distance, just before Tremaine Bay. Arriving at Martini Island, and picking our way through the reefs surrounding Martini Island. Coming into land at Tremaine Bay, or Skidder Beach, and, as expected, I've got the place to myself. My boat on the beach, and a couple of logs for a handy kayak rack. There was a fairly clear tent spot in the uplands, but I preferred a level spot on the beach. The sand was quite thin at this spot, so I had to use rocks to hold my tent in place. Lots of driftwood around to make for a nice kitchen. Here's an evening view of my camp, with a perfect little harbor at high tide on the west side. And a beautiful sunset to end the day. The next morning, and here's Claire's flight coming in from Vancouver. I wanted my final day's paddle to be short, so I had purposely chosen my last campsite to be only a couple of hours paddle from Port Edward. My route on my last day would take me past Lima Point at the southern tip of Digby Island, back across the mouth of Prince Rupert Harbor to Coast Island, then back up Porpoise Channel to Port Edward, a total of 5.8 nautical miles. Ready to launch. Heading south across Tremaine Bay. Rounding Lima Point, the southern tip of Digby Island. This is the beach at Lima Point, and it looks like it might be a nice campsite if you don't mind all the boat traffic going in and out of the harbor. The backup batteries for my marine radio had crapped out on me, so this time I didn't call Prince Rupert traffic, and instead snuck across the mouth of the harbor in stealth mode. A commercial fishing boat headed the other way, flying an American flag. Heading back up Porpoise Channel to Port Edward. Coming into the boat launch. And there's Claire coming down the ramp, the sweetest sight a man could ask for at the end of a kayak trip. Enough whiskey left for a toast to the end of the trip. And then dinner on Prince Rupert's Cow Bay waterfront.